Brett Bruen is there. Okay. Okay, welcome everybody. It is November 27th, 2023. An amazing opportunity to talk to Brett Bruen. I'm not sure I can describe him adequately. He's a brilliant fellow. He was Foreign Service, and he grew out of that and was asked to go to the NSC, the National Security Council, as communications director. That's an amazingly important job. He did that very effectively. And then he thought, I could do something more. And he started from this very high point in his career. He took a leap. He took a chance and he created his own startup. And I'm so glad that it's doing so well. A startup of this sort has to keep a certain amount of anonymity, like who are the customers. We don't talk about that, but we can talk about how do you create a startup with the skills that you have learned as a public diplomacy officer, first in the U.S. Foreign Service, then in the National Security Council. And what is public diplomacy? Brett Bruen, you're so busy. We're really grateful you could give us some time today. And over to you, Brett.
Thanks, Sam. And good morning, good afternoon, wherever you happen to be tuning in from. It's great to have a chance, as always, to join Dan's classes. I know he brings together some very interesting, very passionate folks. As was described, I am a recovering diplomat, and I've spoken with Dan about this before. One of the challenges or necessities in diplomacy, depending on how you look at it, is that you do have to engage in kind of circumlocucious communications. We throw around terms like, empowering youth or protecting democracy, but what does that actually mean?
One of my favorites is we call on, and that's a phrase that was used by Ralph Bunche, and people listen to him because it was Ralph Bunche. When others use that phrase, they go unnoticed. So tell us more about circumlocution.
So in transitioning from the diplomatic service into private practice, I discovered you have to be a little bit more direct in how you're communicating, both to get the clients, but also then to actually do the work. So just briefly, we are a communications firm headquartered here in Washington, with offices in LA as well as now Atlanta. And our work specializes in what you can imagine are some of the most challenging, complex issues that companies, organizations run into. So, in terms of things we can talk about, as Dan said, there's a lot companies, organizations prefer we not discuss. But, earlier this year, the organization that was set up by Nelson Mandela and other former heads of state called the Elders came to us and said, well, we want to figure out how do you make the nuclear threat cool. And it was an interesting challenge in that you have an issue like nuclear war that just isn't getting traction, especially with younger generations. When I grew up in the 1980s, and I'm sure when Dan was growing up, that was not only something that you talked about a lot, but even in movies like Red Dawn, it was portrayed in popular culture. And we've kind of lost that. And the point the elders were making was, yes, it's very important that we have so much attention on, for instance, climate change. And obviously COP 28, I think, is kicking off this week in the Emirates. But their challenge to us was, okay, how do you now duplicate that in the case of the nuclear threat, which obviously, whether it's from Russia, North Korea, China, non-state actors is and remains a significant problem. And so, our work was in developing creative ways that the elders, some of their donors, could help to draw more popular interest in the topic. And as an example, ideas we came up with were nuclear themed potato chips. So the idea being, just like you have cross promotion on other consumer products, if you had nuclear flavored Doritos, maybe people would have a consciousness raised about, oh, well, why are the Doritos nuclear flavored? I'm sure some people would even want to buy them just because it sounded like a strange, unique thing to do. We came up with a party for actors in Hollywood called It's a Blast, where it would be a nuclear wasteland, and they would dress up with nuclear themed outfits. Again, similar to what you've seen with celebrities around the environment, that this would be another way for them to raise interest and awareness. We also did earlier this year, some may have seen, a rebranding for the World Bank. Their flagship report on the business climate in every country in the world came under some scrutiny, is a euphemistic way to put it, a couple of years ago. And the old report, which was called Doing Business, needed to be retired and replaced with a new brand. And they asked us to lead a process in doing that, ultimately, which got us to the brand Business Ready. So every country in the world will be judged on its business readiness. But I will never forget the meetings at the World Bank where trying to come up with a brand that works in 200 plus countries. And somebody would say, well, in Moldovan or in Mongolian, that term doesn't translate well. So ultimately, it's, as described in those two cases, work on international campaigns, but we also do quite a lot. In fact, most of our work is around thought leadership. So we work helping organizations or companies to generate more interest either in their corporate social responsibility, in their issues that they're advocating for. So we have a whole part of the firm now that just does podcasts. And if you're interested in podcasts, I would recommend a couple of them. We've got one on world affairs, which I imagine is a interesting area for many of you, called One Decision. And it features the former head of MI6, Richard Dearlove. And we interview other world leaders, newsmakers each week on the podcast. In fact, last week, for those of you who are in Ukraine or Eastern Europe, we interviewed the Deputy Prime Minister of Moldova on the threat Russia represents for his country. We also do quite a lot, as the name suggests, of crisis communications. And this, was something in the Foreign Service, working in countries like Ivory Coast, Guinea, Madagascar, Iraq, and Venezuela. Got a chance to perfect some of those skills. And one of the things, I now teach a class at Georgetown. If any of you choose to pursue a degree there, it's on crisis communications and this concept of how do you move crisis response into a more proactive position. So as an example, just in the last few days, we got a request from a Jewish organization here in the US that is really concerned not only about, obviously, the broader conversation around anti-Semitism, but specifically some of the things that local leaders in their community are proposing. And they felt like, they have really gotten behind the ball. They have lost control of the narrative, where there's this conflation of Zionism and Judaism. There's a conflation of some of these terms around genocide versus protecting civilians, and what they're looking for, and what is sort of a standard crisis response that we will do, is saying, okay, how do you go from a point where you're just in a responsive, reactive posture to helping to create a more constructive context for the conversation, and then ultimately, hopefully, and this is the notion of counter-crisis communications, of actually seizing an opportunity amidst crisis. Because one of my favorite examples of counter-crisis theory goes back to ancient China. And if you are at all familiar with Mandarin, the word crisis is represented by two symbols. There's one symbol for danger, and there's one symbol for opportunity. And the point being that, especially these days where we live in a time where risk is regular, crises are common, you have to move beyond that old crisis communications approach of like batten down the hatches, hide under your desk, and weather the storm. What we do and what I teach is, okay, how do you actually develop the skills, the strategies to go out into the storm and to try and grab a hold of the issue and to direct it towards a not just calmer waters, but also thinking about writing the next chapter in your organization, in your government's or company's story. Because the misnomer, I think, and we're seeing this play out time and time again, is that crisis management, old crisis management, is based on the notion that you can reset, that you can go back to where you are. And the reality is, especially these days, there is no returning to where you were. The world will have changed, your organization, the conversation will have changed. So you have to have the ability to engage on what comes next. And too often, I think it's left to others to define. And so, we had another crisis with a client last week, and it's one of those cases where, story goes out in the news. We, as the consultant, will say, you should get out there. You should, engage to ensure that the facts and that your side is there. But you also have a reluctant leadership. You have concerns, and so you're always balancing a lot of these considerations. I think the key for what all of you are studying, and I guess what helpful advice I could offer, is I don't think anybody should be graduating from college, certainly not from graduate school, without a certificate, without a specialization and a capacity to manage risks and crisis. Because the world that we currently face and the world that you all will inherit is one in which there are just enormously complex challenges. And those who can rise to the moment, who can see clearly in the midst of a storm, are going to thrive, are going to be able to create that opportunity. And I tell my students at Georgetown, their last project is creating what's called a countermeasure. The notion is, okay, I can figure out ahead of time what are my most likely and my most damaging vulnerabilities. Now, what would I need in that situation to deploy, to be able then, let's say, for instance, that you own a restaurant and your most likely, most damaging vulnerability is food poisoning or some issue with it. What would I need in order in that moment for my restaurant not to lose all of its customers? And you create what's called a countermeasure. You think about, okay, how do I have coupons ready that say, next week, free sandwiches, free meals at the restaurant, which ideally, obviously, you want to make sure all the issues are properly addressed, but then that incentivizes the customers to come back, to share on social and through just word of mouth that, hey, Brett's barbecue is still a great place to eat, and you have that ready to go. Because if you wait too long, the narrative, the negative narrative sets in. And what I tell the students is, look, think about where either you are working currently or you want to work. Identify a risk and then propose a way of addressing it if that vulnerability should get exploited. And, as a prospective employer, somebody walks into my office here and says, hey, I've already thought about what are some of your most likely and most damaging risks, and I've come up with some ways to address them. That, for me, is a candidate that's going to stand out. That's somebody who I'm interested in hiring because they have taken the effort to understand what my potential problems are. And I think one aspect of what we didn't do enough of in government, which I've learned to bring it back full circle in the private sector, is, you have to, whether you're applying for a job, whether you're pitching a client or work, you have to show that you're solving a problem that somebody urgently needs addressed. Because in government, we do a lot of things that are nice to do, that are perhaps, some leaders' brilliant notion that we should spread baseball around the world. But in business, you have to ultimately present somebody with a solution to their problem. And thinking about how you put everything that you are doing in those terms. Because somebody comes to me and says, well, I really want to end child poverty. And I'll say, that's great, but we also have to keep the lights on. We also have to ensure that our staff and their families don't get into poverty. So in terms of order of prioritization, I'm going to focus on where things are most urgent for those around us. And there may be a way through our work. And I always encourage our team to think about, okay, well, if you want to tackle something, how do we make money doing it? And ultimately, in business, which is where I now sit, that's the criteria. I'm not saying we shouldn't tackle poverty. In fact, for those who are in Ukraine, we work with a charity called Kids Save that's very present in Ukraine, working with orphans and families now that are at risk as a result of the conflict. And it's great work, and it's a very meaningful organization, and we help them both to raise awareness of what's happening to kids in Ukraine, here in the US, older kids in foster care. But it's all through the lens of, here's the value that it generates for your organization so that you can raise more money, so that you can obviously pay us and conduct the work that you want. But I think it's an illustration of, since the war started in Ukraine, how here's an organization that's been able, with some help from us, to really expand the support that they can provide by telling their story really well, by getting out there and engaging. And I think, oftentimes nonprofits, governments as well, can be guilty of, well, we're doing great work and people should just recognize it. They should, discover it. And the truth of the matter is that people are busy. Things take time to uncover. And so the work that we do is often trying to bring attention to worthy causes, to bring attention to important issues. And we do that through a variety of ways, whether it's through the media, through what we call owned content, so the social posts, the videos, the blogs, and the other stories that people do, through events and other engagements. And ultimately, as I've told Dan before, it is public diplomacy. It's just public diplomacy by a different means. Often I like to think more effective because I don't have to spend weeks or months debating with a bunch of different government officials whether or not we should do it. Ultimately, if you can convince a client in a 30-minute meeting that this makes sense, then you just go ahead and do it. And that's the part of my work now that I most enjoy, is I don't have to water down a proposal beyond recognition. I just have to present it really well, make the case of why it's a good investment, and then obviously execute it well. So I'll stop there, Dan, and I'm sure there are folks who've got questions and areas of interest.
This is marvelous, and I've always admired what you do. When we talked a year ago, you were talking about trying to predict the crisis rather than wait and respond to it. I'm sure that's part of your methodology. Some very general questions, and I too found that bureaucracies tend to issue very bland statements that people easily ignore. That's certainly the case with, let's say, the State Department today, and even the National Security Council. Jake Sullivan is a smart guy. He says things and people ignore him. So what you're doing is really is so important. Some general questions. A couple of students in this group have selected as their final project the effort to create a strategy for a public diplomacy strategy. Now, judging on what you've just said, I'm guessing that you would find this in the private sector. This would basically just slow you down and prevent you from acting quickly. But thinking back to your foreign service career, what is a public diplomacy strategy? And should we even bother with thinking of such things? Stratcom, we used to call it.
Yeah, and Dan, this is one of those issues that I still think back at how we did things. And I remember the former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, Rick Stengel, was coming in and he was asking for advice. And I told him, you're going to get a bunch of assistant secretaries who are sitting around a table and you're going to hold up a photo of a girl in Afghanistan or a girl in Colombia and say, look, she has a book now. Isn't this great? We're doing good work. And the fact of the matter is, we do a lot of things in public diplomacy to say we did them. Mm-hmm. And we don't spend enough time thinking about what is the impact that we are driving towards. And I often heard coming up in my career that these things couldn't be measured because it took decades to actually track some of these metrics. And then I go out into the business world and lo and behold, discover that no, actually, a lot of this stuff can be measured and I think should be measured. What I find as important in a public diplomacy strategy is first acknowledging what can you impact. Because there are these, as we talked about at the beginning, these massive issues. Like I want to eradicate poverty, or I want to create gender equality. Great, let's do it. But your strategy cannot be, well, we're going to go out and preach about gender equality, and it's just going to happen. I mean, I remember getting to Iraq, and by the time I was there in 2008, all of the women's centers that we had created to empower Iraqi women were closed. Mm-hmm. Because what American officials wanted to do was to open a bunch of women's centers, which would play well back in Washington and say, look, we have empowered Iraqi women because there are all these centers, not taking into account the fact that especially in the early 2000s in Iraq, most women would be far too afraid to go to a place called a women's center, and the ones who would go are not the ones we need to reach. And so figuring out, okay, well, how do we actually create that first or second step? And so when I was there, my whole strategy for Saladin province, where I was based, which was also formerly the home of Saddam Hussein and his family, was around libraries. And I said, look, our goal ought to be educating. Like, in order to empower, I think education is a prerequisite. So we've got to somehow reach women, girls with knowledge. The most culturally acceptable way to do that is at a library. And, even if the mother isn't able to take off time, she can bring her kids to the library for reading or an activity, and she can be exposed or can engage with some of the material there. And by the time that I was done, one of my sort of proudest accomplishments in the year I spent was we brought 1 million books into the province.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I remember, when I got married that year, and I asked folks not to send gifts, but to send books to Iraq, and we got a lot of books and took them out. One time we were in a place called Adar, which was home of a lot of Republican Guard, and got to the library, and some Al-Qaeda fighter lobs a grenade over the side of the wall. And I hit the ground with the library director, and I look over at him and I said, do you think we should throw a book back at him? And so that was my thing. And again, I would suggest that, public diplomacy has to be driven by, this is what we can accomplish in a year, in 2 years. And to do that, we're going to engage in the following things. And this is how they connect. Because just throwing a bunch of stuff at the wall may be a beautiful work of art, Jackson Pollock style, but it does not a strategy make. And I think it's important for us to really be deliberate and methodical about saying we're going to do the following things that we expect, or based on other work, will result in the following outcomes.
Here's a thought experiment for you. And if you can answer this question, you'll be billing me for $10 million. But I don't know. Maybe we could do a payment plan on this. I know you have a family connection, but with Ukraine. And let's say Ukraine came to you and said, our foreign ministry understands that it has a public diplomacy challenge. We see countries in the global south peeling off from support of Ukraine in the United Nations. Either they're indifferent or they abstain. They seem to be under the spell, for some reason, of Russia and China, and these countries don't care about us. Please give us a public diplomacy strategy. Again, that's worth tens of millions of dollars. What elements? Show us some leg. What might we think about if we were the foreign ministry in Kyiv, thinking about how to explain to the global south the situation we're in, and to draw them in, to make them feel that they too are affected by our struggle?
Well, you're right. I do have half of my family is Ukrainian, or formerly from Ukraine, from Kamenets-Podolsky in the West, and took a train from Kyiv out many years ago. It was a great experience, and had the privilege, when I was at the White House back in 2013, 2014, to host some Ukrainian communications officials. I think that the the error that both Ukraine and the US and other NATO allies are making, to your question, Dan, about like how are they engaging the developing world. And I've had conversations with folks in the administration, Biden administration, about this. Their arguments are not based on what those leaders want or need to hear. It's about what we want to say.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're making this, about democracy. We're making this about the stability of the old international order. And I don't think if I'm in Luanda or if I'm in Maputo, that necessarily has a whole lot of relevance or sways me in a significant way. What I think has to be done, and I also should acknowledge, the communication strategy that President Zelensky and his team have engaged in over the last 2 years is really commendable, and I think has done a whole lot to break through Russian propaganda, something that I was often struggling because Russian propaganda, as those in Ukraine will know, is very emotionally tinged. And we would always come in with these very fact based arguments of how we were responding to disinformation. I think what Zelensky has done has been a lot more effective. But if you're going to reach developing countries, then I think we have to reframe the conversation. And again, it cannot just be about what we are against. It has to be about what we are for. And so for me, it's important that the US, Ukraine, our NATO allies look at how do we create a not just a military alliance, not just a political alliance, but we ought to have a NATO for the economy, and bringing in those countries in the global south that say, freedom, the rule of law is also an alliance, a block, a fundamental precept. And if we create common cause between Ukraine and Ghana and Nigeria and Cote d'Ivoire and other countries, and saying, like, we are a space in which, yes, political freedom can thrive, but also economic freedom can thrive. And so investors look to us because we are the places in which your investment will thrive the most. Now, all of a sudden, that's a different argument for those leaders to advocate around. And I think, one of the things that we have seen, and I've got a presentation this week to a Taiwanese company looking at some of the issues around China and the US. And what we've been telling clients is, watch out. If you have significant investments in China, if you have significant dependency on China for your supplies, what we've seen in Russia with their invasion of Ukraine is that companies now can be forced on the basis of human rights, significant human rights issues, to pull out, to change course. And so I think that is a model for other countries to emulate. And again, with this notion of an economic alliance, that there is the opportunity for that effect to not only be from the US or European or other countries, but broader, that says, look, we're going to hold to certain principles. An attack on one's economy is an attack on all.
Article 5 in the economic sphere. Brett, what you've just told us certainly is worth $50 million. Instead of money, we give you admiration. It's funny you mentioned the liberal international order, because that has been the subject we've talked about in the last 2 weeks. Many of the individuals in this group have submitted marvelous, wonderful papers on this topic. We see that this is rapidly dissolving, disappearing, especially in the global south. And in many of the papers that our colleagues here have written, they say we need a reform of some sort in the so-called liberal rules-based international order, because China and Russia have chipped away at it. The global south doesn't want to hear about it because they see it as dominance from Europe and North America. Any ideas? Is there any reason to preserve the so-called liberal rules-based international order? And if so, what would we need to do to reform it?
Well, I've spent a not insignificant amount of time thinking about this, and I think I've mentioned before the notion of how we entered a post-American era, and I don't say that with any sense of satisfaction as an American and a former American diplomat, but I think we have to acknowledge that our influence internationally ain't what it used to be. And despite, and I wrote a article at the beginning of the Biden administration that looked at what the world might be if Biden didn't succeed in putting it back together. Mm-hmm. And I think we're not far off of that. And yet, and I think you can certainly also acknowledge that the Biden administration has been strong, a little bit late, but strong on Ukraine, and pulled together an international coalition as part of the defense of Ukraine. But I think where we're heading in this notion of a post-American era is that we will have spheres of influence. And so there will be parts of the world where the US, Europe, allies like Japan, Australia are strong. And there will be areas where we're not. I mean, you talk about, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, even Brazil, India, countries where, yes, there's been strong ties between the West and many of those leaders. And yet, you got Mohammed bin Salman saying, well, I'm sort of, liberated from the constraints of that Western world order. And so I'm, the world is going to now center around Riyadh, and it's going to now center around all of our money. And I think what that results in is a whole lot of friction, like we've seen between Armenia and Azerbaijan, mm-hmm. like we're seeing, I think, in efforts, including by the Saudis, to challenge the traditional red lines, for instance, in so shockingly murdering one of their dissidents in their own consulate. One of my former colleagues said, you don't do that unless you want to send a message, and that clearly the Saudis wanted to send a message, and so I think it's disturbing, but we have to acknowledge that that is the world we now live in, and that we, in order to be effective, I think we need, and unfortunately there isn't a good global alliance of democracies. And so what you're seeing right now is, on the one hand, NATO, and I remember I was at NATO's summit last year in Madrid and talked to some of the leaders about this question of, okay, does NATO expand to Asia or to other parts of the world? And there are some who would like to have us do that. There's others who think we should stay focused on Europe. And you have the Biden administration holding these pretty superficial summits about democracy, and not a great deal that's actually being done with them. But if we're serious about solving this problem, I think it does come down to, in addition to my NATO alliance for the economy, I think you need either an expanded NATO or some other international entity that can serve as a counterweight to some of these efforts, whether it's by China, Russia, countries in the Middle East or elsewhere, to upend the international order, to create more instability and to repress rights. So we need that. I'm not seeing any strong signs that we're heading there. And I will just say, on Ukraine specifically, one of my frustrations with what Biden hasn't done is, I would have expected after Russia invaded, after year one, where he goes to Poland and gives this big speech. Okay, what's our strategy? Like, how are we going to work towards bringing this conflict to an end? And it's one of the debates that's happening here in Washington now is, okay, you want tens of billions of more dollars, but to what end? And of course, it's very difficult to say, well, we'll be able to recapture all of the conquered territory, or we'll be able to drive Russia out of Luhansk and Donetsk. But I think something is needed. And you compare, and as a communicator, I look back to what was Churchill saying, what was Roosevelt saying during, or even Woodrow Wilson during the First World War. There was an ambition to why we are fighting. And there was an ambition set to what we could do. And that is really absent right now. And I think it's led to some of the divisions between countries. I think it's led to some of the divisions within countries. And we really need to put forward a stronger sense of what a successful outcome looks like, both in Ukraine and I think more broadly.
I want to get one more crack at you, and then I hope others will come in. You all realize that Brett is challenging basically everything we thought we knew, and Brett is successful in what he's doing. The U.S. government less so, and he knows both sides of this. It becomes personal to me, Brett, when you mention the murder of Kamal Khashoggi, because I'm doing an article now on U.S. policy in Africa. I had a very short version of the article, 4 words. There really isn't one. And then I expanded it to 8,000 words. In calling around to people to get their opinions, I spoke with a member of the African diaspora who lives in Chicago, and he cited that very instance of the reason why Africans, I'm now talking about U.S. public diplomacy. He said, clearly we know that Mohammed bin Salman ordered the death of Kamal Khashoggi, and yet what were the consequences? There were a few weeks of kind of a sense of, you've been bad, don't do that, and followed by an open door to Saudi Arabia. And Africans in the global South see terrible, terrible offenses being committed by their governments, and they see no reaction from the U.S. government. So they see this, they tend to not listen to us. I think you made a very important point a bit earlier. You said, don't concentrate on what we want to say, think rather about what the listener wants to hear. That's really, really important. And anyone in this group who's thinking of doing a paper on public diplomacy strategy, let's say for the Ukraine government, listen to Brett. This is very important. And then finally, you said the Biden superficial summit. I think you're talking about the African Leaders Summit. I was lamentably part of that, and we can talk another time, but I found it so pointless that I left. I felt that I could not be part of this. It was pointless. It was simply talking heads. There was no conversation. There was no listening by in any way. I see that Sean Moore, who's been a loyal follower, not a follower, he's been one of us going back to last year, has a comment. Sean, how do we unmute you? Can you unmute yourself, Sean? Let's see. Here. Okay. Sean Moore has a comment. He's calling in from Tennessee, I believe.
Yes, sir. Can you hear me, sir?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I'm just enjoying it stuff, but I've got to be honest. That was a mistake. I reached over to turn the volume up and actually raised my hand by accident. So I apologize for that.
Now that you're on, you gotta participate. Sean, what are your thoughts about what we've just been hearing?
I mean, certainly with the it puts a different perspective on the entire diplomacy when you have a startup corporation coming in and operating that way. And just think about times as it's going through, it's just thinking the overlapping between that and government organizations. And having been abroad, a lot of times I saw that the international organizations had more impact than the government. People responded faster to the flexibility on the ground to be able to do those things. Came more from the NGOs and from startups.
Can you give us any examples? When you say international organizations, you mean World Bank, EU? Are you talking about nonprofits?
Nonprofits, yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah. Sean, tell us about that, because and I must say I have an agenda here. We have several dozen young people ready to embark on careers. Any comment that can give some insight on a possible career for somebody who cares about the world, who cares about the matters we're talking about? Whenever possible, I want to provide some examples of how you can make a living doing this. So Brett or Sean, how does one make a life out of joining a non-governmental organization? How do you do that?
One of the things I've seen is certainly when I was in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, was the International Educators Program. And people were actually going there and teaching for a year. And it's, it is diplomacy at the last 3 feet. I mean, you are the representative in those countries of Teachers Without Borders and those situations. You are the sole representative at times of your country in that area.
Yeah, not to mention Peace Corps for Americans. And why not conduct similar operations? I don't know if Ukraine or Kazakhstan or Kenya can create a Peace Corps, but they can certainly organize ad hoc activities that are similar to that. Veronica Sheptuchovska has a comment.
Yeah, actually, I have a question to Brett. First of all, thank you for for sharing your thoughts and experiences. It's very valuable. So I have a question concerning public communications. I don't know if you're aware of it, but at the time, the majority of Ukrainians are very dissatisfied and frustrated of major international organizations such as the UN because of their inaction and high politicization in the context of a Russian-Ukrainian war. So how can the reputation of international organizations and faith in them be restored into Ukrainian society? And is it necessary at all? And if so, if it is necessary, whose responsibility is it? Is it on the Ukrainian government or on the international partners or on the international organizations themselves? And what are your thoughts about it?
Marvelous question. I've been sort of keeping track, and every time there's been a vote in the General Assembly on Russia's crimes, the number of votes opposed to Russia decreases. Now, this is partly because of Russian disinformation. There may be some threats that are not visible. You know, if you vote in such and such a way, we will find a way to punish you. Brett, that's a very painful and important factor that the Global South is beginning to say openly, why should we support a Western effort to rescue Ukraine when we ourselves, Sudan, South Sudan, the many coups, Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, there's trouble in Madagascar. You seem to ignore those things while you're putting all of your rhetoric into Ukraine. It begins to sound like a northern alliance rather than a world alliance. Brett, any comment on that?
Yeah, and also I just Dan want to flag for folks that I've got to drop off at the top of the hour, but Veronica, thank you for the question. And I think there are a couple elements to it. One is that you brought up, you know, after the war, there will be a lot of repair of the reputation of some of these multilateral organizations in Ukraine. And I think that it is valid. I would also say you probably, as we've discussed, got this challenge of how can Ukraine make more inroads into both those organizations as well as we were talking about, some of the countries of the Global South. And to do that, I think it does have to, one, be positioned as a broader issue of, you know, yes, there were all of these challenges that are happening, including some of the attacks or the violence that's being waged in other parts of the world. And so, you know, if Ukraine can lead an effort, or if Ukraine with some of the Western allies can lead an effort, look, we need to address, have an international initiative that looks at how civilians, for instance, are being unjustly, grotesquely caught up in some of these battles. I think you can develop a broader array of countries that and actors that would have interest in that topic. I also think that, you know, and this is what we're seeing now, is Ukraine now approaching the second or the third year of the conflict, you know, starts to grapple with the waning support, the waning interest. And I would look for ways that I can bring Ukraine to some of those places. And I think, you know, a lot has obviously been done by President Zelensky and other senior members of the government. But, you know, are there ways in which there are Ukrainian, not just officials, but Ukrainian cultural, sports, other figures who are leading these kind of conversations about broader issues, not just, you know, the discussion about the plight of the Ukrainian people, but about this these broader challenges, so that Ukraine remains as relevant, remains as front of mind for leaders in those places, because I think it does have to be, unfortunately, about getting into conversations that aren't as Ukrainian-centric, so that Ukraine stays in the mix and stays a priority, and hopefully grows in support from some of these places where it hasn't always enjoyed that same level of support.
That's a very tall order, isn't it? Ukraine's kind of busy with other things, but this is a very valuable thought to make Ukraine relevant to others' issues. Now, Brett, I know you have another commitment in about 1 minute. And I'd like to continue, everybody. I'd like to continue after Brett has to leave us. I'm sorry, we reluctantly let you go. Any summary, any advice, career, prevailing of a Ukrainian viewpoint in the global South? What comes to mind? And in your own, this marvelous business that you have created and which is doing so well.
Well, look, I would say that despite all of the talk about AI, despite, the technological changes, this notion of how humans communicate with one another will always be an essential part of our society, and for our purposes, I think will be a business that will continue to grow. And I guess my last point, extending on that, is the notion that relationships, an AI technology cannot develop a relationship with someone. Only a human can do that. And that ultimately, if you ask me what's been successful, what's been, the formula, it's all about relationships. It's about understanding people. It's about, I describe it as a continuum of contact, from when you are initially exposed through to how you educate someone about your work and engage them. And I think that ultimately is the key to success, is fostering those relationships over the course of many years. And now that you are all sort of engaged in your studies, encourage you to use that as a tactic in how you are pursuing your careers. Don't think about it just in terms of what do I need right now, but developing relationships that will serve you well over the long term.
This sounds perfectly right to me. Let me just add a third thing to the two you've mentioned. I was trying to teach something related to this once, and a colleague said to me, "What can humans do that machines cannot do?" And I had a eureka moment. Tell stories. Humans can tell stories, machines cannot. So I would just add that to your very bold thinking, and I'm so glad you've escaped the bureaucratic system that was really holding you back. I remember those days when you and I both were kind of bothered by what we were not encouraged to do. You have taken it, you've run with it, Brett, and we really commend you for it. Thank you for this wonderful hour. And I hope anyone who wants to can stay on the call after Brett leaves, and we can discuss a bit more. We're very grateful for this unorthodox thinking that you're doing, and which teaches us a lot. Thanks, Brett. Okay, bye-bye. Now, this is too interesting to stop, I think. Anybody who wants to continue. Sean, is that a genuine hand? I'm clicking, this is troublesome. I'm clicking the thing that says unmute Sean, and it's not responding. Isn't that bothersome? Let me try again. Sean, I'm sorry. I'm trying to give you the microphone. System is not allowing that. I
think Sean has talking permitted if he would like.
Okay, Sean. Can you come in, Sean? On my screen, he seems to be muted. Can we go to whoever is using the name Peterson Waweru today? Could be anybody. It could be Peter Mbuva. Could it be who do we have from Kenya on the call?
Yes, Peter Mbuva.
Peter Mbuva. Okay, you're
Kenya.
very welcome.
Thank you. Can I react to the previous Brett's presentation.
Please, that's what we want. Yes, yes. I mean, Brett is gone, but let's reflect together on things that he has
Oh,
said.
thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was a profound presentation. He appeared to me as a communication expert,
Yes.
and actually it resonates well with our discussion because looking at the narratives being used and advanced by the developed world, such as the United States compared to China, which is classified as developing, but projections showing by 2032 it could overtake great economies. I realize the global south is losing steadily compared with the developed world. Look at writings by Francis Fukuyama, The End of History and The Last Man. That in itself portrays that democracy is the only governance tool that the entire world should adopt, and others have no option. While China, which is a communist, takes precedence of improving the economic rights of the citizens, other than taking center stage on issues of human rights. And I think that is the bone of contention.
Mm-hmm.
And moving forward, I think we need to shift that through the use of academia as a tool, because there is too much dependency on China, and it is able also to influence the manner in which governance is being run in the African countries. Thank you so much, Professor Dan.
Very, very valuable, Peter. Thank you. Thank you so much. Poor Francis Fukuyama. People have been laughing at him ever since he published the article in the book. And what he has said, I don't know the truth of this, but he has said, when I said end of history, I did not mean that history was finished. I meant history has a purpose. The end, he says that he used the word end in a different sense. I don't know if this was just a clever way of making up for a gaffe, or whether there's some truth to that he was talking not about humanity having reached the end, but rather looking forward to a goal. He used the word end. He probably wishes that he had used the word goal instead of end. But you're quite right, Peter, in saying that this has been interpreted, rightly or wrongly, as saying democracy is the only system that is valid for the global south, whereas there may be other models. We know that many countries in China, for lack of a better model, they're openly embracing the Chinese model, and it's understandable. We wish that they would consider democracy and human rights more seriously, but that's what we have. I think Sean, can we unmute Sean at this? Ellie, can you? I can't do it. I keep saying.
I've asked him to unmute.
I've done so also. Sean, are you with us? I see the mute sign. This is the software, folks, is not responding. We're asking. Sorry, we'll have to go to someone else. Among the things that Brett was saying, I thought I would mention the Global Engagement Center, the GEC, we call it the GEC. You could see, I think you could all understand that Brett left the US government because he was frustrated. He felt limited, and he felt that the ideas that he had were not getting a chance in the fora that actually determined foreign policy. Now, in responding supposedly to Russian disinformation and Chinese and extremist groups in the Middle East, the State Department set up a unit called the Global Engagement Center. We call it the GEC. It has something like 200 employees. And what do? They look at disinformation. They track information. They identify disinformation. They make charts. They quantify. as far as I can see, and I've talked to them many times about this, they don't do anything. They don't do anything. They track it, they study it, they hold conferences, they try to educate the public on how to detect this information. But in terms of actually confronting it, we've mentioned debunkeu.org, which is the group a couple of you are actually working with them in Lithuania. I know of no other group that's actually on the social media confronting Russian disinformation. The US government has explained to me, well, we have a big disadvantage because we always have to tell the truth. And the truth is not sexy. The truth is not dramatic. And so because we have this high standard of fact checking and never telling an untruth, this disarms us because Russian disinformation does not have these limits. They use untruths and lies all the time. And as a democracy, we believe we should not be doing that. Therefore, we have a huge disadvantage. There's something wrong here. I can share with the group a paper I did some months ago. If a government cannot do this, and if an NGO can, like debunkeu.org, let's help the NGO. Let's give them the resources that they need. I've made this point with, I'm not a person of influence, but I've argued that point with the Global Engagement Center. Why not help those who are free to, not to tell lies, but to make dramatic and effective and visceral responses to disinformation, because governments are not doing this. Is there any other comment on Brett's thinking while we're waiting for those to come up? Again, Sean, this is crazy. And maybe Ellie can do better than I can. The software is not recognizing as I click on S. Sorry, maybe you can put
I
something.
think he may just not have a comment. Maybe an artifact hand.
Sean, that may be a legacy hand, but if you have something to add, maybe you could put it in the chat. Let's think for just a moment of some of the final papers you're doing. Some of you have thought about doing a public diplomacy strategy, let's say hypothetically or fictionally, for the foreign ministry of Ukraine or of Kazakhstan or of Kenya. This would be a marvelous exercise. I think what we've learned today is that governments, for good reasons, and we don't blame them for this, but they tend to go slower because governments, the virtue of governments is that you have a number of people working on a project, and you cannot, it's not possible to just take one person's idea and make it into policy. Policy is the summation of the opinions of several or many people within a system. That's when an opinion turns into a policy, and that's a good thing. A policy is not simply one thing that one person thought about. We did not talk about that with Brett, but there is a virtue in having an idea circulate within a system and having different voices come in and say, well, this could work, but maybe this other thing might be better. Brett has the freedom to have his own idea and to pursue it. As you're working, a small number of you have said you might be wanting to do, just to see how you do it, a public diplomacy strategy. If you do that, please think of this in both terms. What would a strategy be for somebody like Global Situation Room, that is Brett Bruen's organization, which would be much quicker, much more direct, much more oriented towards a paying client. You can see how much fun that would be, right, professionally, versus doing a public diplomacy strategy as part of a foreign ministry policy. The one is not better than the other. It's easy to see in government efforts a pondering slowness and a bureaucratic inefficiency. There is that. On the other hand, the government policy has the advantage of having many voices, many thoughts merging into one in the name of a nation state. So as you, there are a few of you doing public diplomacy strategies. I hope you'll consider that distinction when you're doing this. Several of you are doing resource request documents fictionally for embassies. Let's say the Ukrainian embassy in Brazil, somebody is doing that. The Ukrainian embassy in Poland. I'll be fascinated to see what you come up with. I have provided everybody with a sample. It's fictional, but it's a sample of what the United States government might have as an embassy strategy in Nigeria. Okay, it's just an example. But if you're doing this type of project, I would say go to that example and just see the types of things in the American system. American system is not perfect, but it's what we're able to talk about, what I'm able to talk about. Since and Jack said cool it because we're familiar with this. A country strategy going above or beyond the level of public diplomacy might have, let's say, five goals, not 20, not 30, and not 2, but it could be a public diplomacy could be one of the 5. And how would you define that? If you are the Ukrainian embassy in Brazil, what is your goal? What do you want the Brazilian government or the Brazilian people to think about Ukraine? Do you want them to wish to enter in more closely into a trade relationship? That could be a goal of the country strategy, increased trade relations. Maybe one of your goals is to try to get more support in an international organization like the United Nations, and there are others, to vote, frankly, in favor of things that would go in favor of Ukraine. If you are in American strategies, the United States, when we do strategies for the global South, there's usually an element of we want to develop and sustain a robust private sector. Now, that's because the United States, with its relative wealth, we may not have wealth forever with the amount of debt and deficit that we suffer from, but countries look to us as a source of capital, a source of investment. And I hope that will always be the case. It may not be, but therefore, it's in our interest, in our enlightened self-interest, that there be a vibrant private sector in, let's say, Togo or Benin, because, and thinking very strategically, we love people in Togo, we want them to be happy. But a strategy isn't a matter of people being happy. It's a statement of how we would want to increase our own well-being. Why would we support the development of a private sector in Togo or Benin? Number one, to avoid a situation where Togo becomes a failed state and calls on us for humanitarian aid. That's very costly. If you don't think about the human element, just the money part, we don't want to spend money rescuing people in a failed state. Second reason to develop a vibrant private sector in Togo. If there is one, this creates a middle class that can purchase American goods and services. So it benefits our economy. Sometimes if you, we all have human feelings. We want human beings to be better off, more economically able to run their own lives. But if we think strictly in impersonal, strategic terms, there are advantages to doing the right thing. The right thing is to help people in Togo live a better life. Well, as Brett said, that's well and good, but how do you do it And why do you do it? If you are the US government, you do it so as to have fewer demands in the future in helping people in a humanitarian disaster. That's very costly. And we can make a profit by seeing that there's a development of a middle class in a poor country that will be purchasing things. Maybe we can sell items to them. Currently, they fill their kitchens and living rooms with Chinese products because Chinese products are very cheap and they're not great, but they work. Well, maybe I'm thinking America-centric. Maybe we could provide something inexpensive and effective, and then everybody benefits. So I'm just thinking in terms of your final projects, public diplomacy strategy. One or two of you have been in contact with Debunk EU. I think that's fascinating. I really believe in that group. I'm not offended that they won't tell me exactly their methodology because it's only effective if it's known by the very few people who are part of the organization. I think Becky and Tedo has reached out to them from Kenya. Becky, I'm delighted that you've done that. There may be others. And then also some of you have suggested an analysis of a book. I received an absolutely marvelous paper yesterday on Barbara Tuchman, The Guns of August. Marvelous paper. Thank you for that, because I'm so impressed. I'm so moved by your ability to take history and political science and understand how it fits into your particular situation. That paper on Barbara Tuchman, I won't embarrass the author, but I'd actually like to share that paper with everybody. The outbreak of World War I paper talks about conflicts that go beyond national borders, like why would the Austro-Hungarian Empire provoke a conflict in Sarajevo, in Bosnia, which unwittingly extended to the result. Germany invaded neutral Belgium. This is crazy. This is crazy. And the paper that I received talked about proxy wars, of which we have many in the world today. Somebody told me recently, some organization has counted the number of conflicts going on today, and it's over 100. And this is we have to get to work, and the skills that you have and that you're developing make you, I think, effective. You can't solve 100 conflicts, but you can certainly reduce the damage in one or two. So your final projects, there's been a few that I've already received. They're outstanding, and I look forward to the others. I guess the choices were take a recommended book and comment on it in light of your own country's current situation, of which I've received two that are marvelous. Create a public diplomacy strategy. It can be fictional. It can be for the Foreign Ministry of Ukraine or Kazakhstan or Kenya. If you do, I hope you'll take into account what Brett taught us today. And then that separate type of project, which is an entire country strategy, not just public diplomacy, but commerce, democracy, international support in bodies such as the United Nations. I'm really looking forward to these final papers. We're reaching an endpoint, and I guess we're about to finish this session. Just looking ahead, you've seen that this Thursday we get Max Bergman. He is a Russia-Ukraine expert. He's at the Center for International Studies in Washington. CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, which is a very well endowed. If you ever come to Washington and look at the building occupied by CSIS, oh my God, it looks like the Taj Mahal. It's it's somehow they got a lot of money. They do excellent, outstanding analysis. And Max Bergman is one of their stars. I've asked him to talk to us about economic sanctions. Do they work? Do they? And we have these things called targeted sanctions. Do they ever actually change the bad behavior of a government like the government in the Kremlin? We too seldom, I'm afraid. That's what we'll do Thursday. On Monday, 50-50 chance that we'll get Paul Foldy, who was a staff member in the House of Representatives Committee on Foreign Affairs. And as a great friend of foreign affairs, foreign affairs needs to be funded, and we need friends in Congress. That's where the money comes from. Paul Foldy was great, and he made it happen. He understood the importance of foreign affairs. And year after year, he went to the representatives arguing. It may not seem like a local domestic issue. It may seem like a luxury. It's not a luxury. You got to make a budget available for the State Department, USAID, and so forth. And then next Thursday, we will have Tom Kent, who was once the director of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. Now, we had Ruslan Petruchka a couple of weeks ago, the head of the Ukraine unit at the Voice of America. I think we all understand there's the Voice of America, which goes to the whole world in different languages. So there are these bureaucratic separations. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty has a kind of an overlapping mission. Radio Free Europe would be, during the Cold War, was geared towards all countries in Eastern Europe under the domination of the Soviet Union. Radio Liberty was a separate entity broadcasting only to the Soviet Union. Now, RFE, RL, as we call it, has evolved. No more Cold War, a very increased aggressive stance on the part of Russian Federation. Tom Kent wrote to me the book on the subject, which is called Striking Back. You'll see my reference to it when I mention him in the Google Classroom. And then we go into our final meeting on December 11th. I have heard enough feedback, enough positive feedback, that I would like to offer a continuation in the spring for those who are able and those who are interested. And I think we would change the format. We would say, let's just meet once a week. Let's say Mondays. We'll have speakers. We'll have an expert on China. We'll have an expert on ad hoc war crimes tribunals. And we'll have a former U.S. ambassador to Mexico. So we'll broaden from the topics we've been dealing with this semester and talk about other things. And I propose, I know you're all busy and you're working, you're studying. I would propose in the spring, we just have speakers. I might suggest some readings, but I won't require them. I won't require essays or homework. And I would just invite you and anybody you know who would want to join us, just join us for the type of discussion we had with Brett Bruen. So we would start in early January and go to May and talk to Paula Dobriansky, who was the Undersecretary for Global Affairs and is now working on something called Build Back Better, which has to do with Ukraine. She's working very hard with a team that's actually looking at the use of the private sector and the public sector in rebuilding Ukraine after the war. All wars end. No war ends quick enough, but there's a group that includes Ukrainians and Paula Dobriansky is in the lead on this, and I think it would be fascinating to hear her on that. So that's where we stand. We'll go with this series to December 11th. We'll take a pause, and then we'll start up again in rather early January, maybe the second week, something like that. At that point, I invite you to join us. no pressure, no required readings, no assignments. And so we're focusing our efforts at this time on completing this course in about 2 weeks and having a look at your final papers. And it'll be a great privilege to show our recognition to you who have achieved, who can demonstrate that through your papers that you have learned something. And I see already the quality of your input is spectacular, and I'm really honored. I think I'll say goodbye for today. We'll look forward to meeting one another Thursday, 10 o'clock Washington time, to listen to Max Bergman on the topic of economic sanctions. Any comments before we say goodbye? I don't see any. I would say I really value what Brett told us today. It's unorthodox. We have to think in an unorthodox way if we're going to meet the crazy challenges that we're faced with today. We need to be unorthodox. We had a very good example of that today. And have a great week. See you Thursday.
Bye, Jan. Thank you.
Bye, Ellie. Bye-bye.